a contemporary from his time, and a contemporary who was well placed, a former manager, chief manager of the Russian American company, who, after meeting St. Herman, and then in his own retirement, became a monk himself at Kaluga in Russia. So let's begin. St. Herman was born in the 1750s in central Russia. He reposed in 1836 on Spruce Island, Kodiak Archipelago, Alaska. He was canonized in 1970 by the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, and simultaneously, while separately, by the Orthodox Church in America. We should compare and notice St. Seraphim of Sarov's birth, likewise in the 1750s, and repose, 1833. Same time. Our meeting agenda today will look at geography, demography, history, and then the pilgrimage. So we have quite a bit of material to move through. We'll begin with geography. And I suggest that this is the view that is most usual when we think about Alaska, as it is the 49th state. Here's Alaska, the 49th state of the United States, and the orientation is usually westward in this way. Alaska here at the extremity of the world. But right across the Bering Straits, we can see the Chukotka Peninsula, which should be a bit of a hint that there is something more to the story. I myself, by the way, am speaking to you from here, the San Francisco Bay Area of California, the city of Berkeley, near my birthplace, Oakland. Here, yes. So if we look eastward, we begin to fill in the story. We have England, and eastward, we find St. Petersburg, Moscow, then the vast extent of Russia, across Siberia to Irkutsk, in eastern Siberia, up the Lena River to Yakutsk, where I'm very fortunate to spend most of the year, or not used to anyway, before COVID. And then across the taiga to the Sea of Okhotsk, across the Sea of Okhotsk to Kamchatka, along this magnificent extent of the Aleutian Islands, that spans the North Pacific to the Kodiak area and Alaska. And now here I am, looking at all of this from that perspective. Our focus will be on the Kodiak Archipelago that's here. Let me pan in a bit so you can see it. Right there. Anchorage, which is a modern city, not from our time frame, or that is, say, the time frame of this presentation, is located there, you can see. And then St. Herman lived in the Kodiak Archipelago here. It is a northern rainforest, if you can imagine. The Kodiak Island annual rainfall is abundant, as it's described officially, but very difficult to measure because the rain falls when very heavy winds blow. But I think it's fair to say that the precipitation is similar to the rainiest counties in Wales, North Ireland, and Western Scotland, but with a major difference. Without the deforestation, okay, the forests remain and are thick in our area of focus, and the result is a northern rainforest. In fact, the whole area here from the Kodiak Archipelago along the Gulf of Alaska to Southeast Alaska here, all that region is lush as a northern rainforest. It looks like this. Emerald green with moss, thick foliage, thick canopy, lots of water, streams and rivers, and mud. and bears and people. People from time to time, lots of bears. Bears that eat salmon. And these colorful creatures are the species of salmon known as coho. There are three major species of salmon that spawn in the Alaskan rivers. And when I say spawn, they spawn thickly. I mean, like carpets of salmon. And this is the most colorful of them. Of course, other creatures eat them too. And eagles abound in the forest. Now, in order to explore our theme, we need yet another perspective, an Arctic perspective. So let's take a moment to gain that perspective next. Okay, here we have it. Here is Russia from an Arctic perspective, or a sort of Arctic perspective, if you would. So you can see my cursor over here at the left-hand side. That would be approximately St. Petersburg and Lake Ladoga, which we will refer to later, then Moscow, then across the vast extent of Siberia to Irkutsk, and again Yakutsk, the lovely city of Yakutsk, all the way across. There's the Aleutian Islands, and here's Kodiak, our focus right here. And then Southeast Alaska. Let's look at it again. Southeast Alaska, Kodiak, the extent of the Aleutian Islands, Kamchatka, then the breadth of Russia all around the Arctic Circle. We see it here again. There's Kodiak, the southeast of Alaska, where Sitka is located. We will locate Sitka later, the town of Sitka. Kodiak, the Aleutian Islands, Kamchatka. Here is the great area of Yakutia, the largest internal republic of the Russian Federation, let me add. It is almost as big as India, huge. And then Irkutsk here. See it again. There's Irkutsk, Yakutsk, Kamchatka, this wonderful extent of the Aleutian Islands. And then our focus, Kodiak and Southeast Alaska here. And we should extend this further to a view of the North Pacific coast now. So here we have Alaska, the Aleutians, Alaska, Southeast Alaska. And here's where I am speaking to you. And why am I saying this? Not that I'm so much of an egotist, so much of one, but that the southernmost outpost of Russia at the time of St. Herman was just a few miles north of where I am here. It's called Fort Ross. It's about 60, a little over 60, about 60, 64 nautical miles north of San Francisco, Fort Ross. This is a depiction from the time when it flourished, during the time when when Alaska was part of Russia. It was part of Russia until the year 1867, from the the early 1700s until 1867. There it is. Fort Ross is a state historic park today, a California state park, you may be pleased to know. The chapel has been reconstructed. And those of you who know Saint Innocent, that is Saint Innocenti Veniaminov, may also know that he visited Fort Ross in the year 1836. Saint Innocent was instrumental in Alaska history and in the lives of the native Alaskan peoples, but a generation after our subject, St. Herman. He came He was at that time, 1836, he was serving as a parish priest here at Sitka, which was the capital city of Russian America, Alaska. And he traveled southward to Fort Ross on a pastoral visit. And he toured the San Francisco Bay Area as a guest of the Mexican administration of that region at the time. He came from Irkutsk, and he spent his whole life in this area. Yakutsk, Kamchatka, the Aleutians, Sitka, this whole area. We can see here how it's related. If we get this perspective, we do see how all of these areas are related. And indeed they are. They're related demographically also. So let's turn now to demography. Here we have a map of an ethnographic map of the Russian Empire from the year 1862, just after St. Herman's repose, but still accurate in that regard. Here we have the westernmost regions where we have St. Petersburg and also Lake Ladoga, which I mentioned earlier, which we will learn more about later. The extent of Russia to here to Irkutsk, the extent of Russia to Irkutsk here, Yakutsk, Kamchatka, the Aleutian Islands, and Alaska, Kodiak, our focus here. We're going to look at Alaska from this perspective again. Yes, notice here there's Anchorage, modern city, Kodiak, our focus, and Sitka here to the east, that triangle, Anchorage, Kodiak, Sitka. Anchorage is not important for our presentation, it's important now, but Kodiak and Sitka are. There's the orientation, and the orientation is important so that we can focus in on this map of the Alaskan native languages. And this map has been produced by the Alaska Native Languages Center of the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. It's color-coded, and on this map we can see 3 major language families in addition to the various languages within those language families. 3 language families. The first one is Aleut, and we should recall that the Aleutian chain extends all the way to Kamchatka. It's truncated in this map for brevity, but it's its own language family, Aleut. Sometimes there's a supra-language family called Eskimo Aleut, sometimes not. Then we have the Eskimoan languages in blue. Eskimoan is still used in linguistics, although otherwise not used very much at all. And here we have at the very north, the Inupiat. In Canada, it's called Inuit, which are probably the quintessential sort of image of Eskimos, but that's at the far north and only there. The most populous group are the Central Yupik here, numbers of whom are Orthodox. And then the Sugpiaq, as they were known in their own language and are now known as Alutiiq, the Alutiiq people, and they live in the Kodiak area, the Kodiak Archipelago here. Okay. We move eastward over to where Sitka is. We find the Tlingit Nation, Tlingit. They're classed as Indian, if anyone wants to use that categorization, as are the people whose languages are represented in shades of red and other shades of brown. And other than the Tlingit here, which is almost a language isolate, almost, we have these other languages represented in red and brown, which are the Athabaskan languages. Athabaskan languages, they extend through Canada and also extend, interestingly, even down to the southwest of the United States. Navajo and Apache are both Athabaskan languages as well. So then we have the linguistic configuration of Alaska, native languages of Alaska. And our focus is here in Kodiak. Now, next are some drawings depicting Native Alaskan people contemporary with St. Herman in Alaska. They were drawn while he was there in the flesh. Some of them, some of the photographs, not the people, some of the photographs have been colorized. Yes. So here we have from the Aleutian Islands in Aleut, a man of Unalaska Island, published in 1802. All of these drawings, some of which became lithographs later, were produced from Russian Russian around the world voyages that came to Alaska from this date, 1802 onwards. And the glosses that you see in quotation marks are taken from the collections. So Man of Unalaska, 1802, Woman of Unalaska, Aleutian Islands, 1802. Reminder, here's the Aleutian people here, the Aleut. We're looking at this, what's in green. Man and Woman of Unalaska Island, Aleut, 1802. Clothing of the inhabitants of the Aleutian Islands, Aleut, 1816. 1816, and you may notice the cross. The Aleuts were baptized, virtually all by that time. Or I think 1816, we should say many were. By the time St. Innocent came in 1824, they were baptized. Virtually everyone was baptized. At this point, many were, 1816. Yes, and so we see an inhabitant of Unimak Island named Umashik, baptized as Vasily. Aleutoyen Tukuk, a chief of the Fox Islands among the Aleutian Islands, baptized as Kondrati. Toyen Tokuk, chief, Simeon, 50 years old. Simeon, a Christian name. Of Xenia, a baptismal name. Look at this. Afanasi Serebrennikov, Aleut, 1827. Afanasi Athanasios, for those who would recognize it in Greek. Vasily Govorokin, Aleut, 1827. Vasily, baptized. The Aleuts, as well as the Aleutic people, were masters of the kayak. It was an extraordinary achievement on their part. Those are so light that one could carry one on one shoulder, but they are so sturdy that they can withstand the turbulence and rigor of the North Pacific Ocean, no less. And they use these as transportation and also as for the hunt, for transportation and also for the hunt. Masters of the craft. They also developed their clothing to suit, visors that they decorated colorfully to keep the rain out of their faces, and then raincoats that they stitched up from seal guts. Amazing. Okay, here's a depiction of kayaks from 1828. And I'm emphasizing this because St. Herman and later St. Innocent both used these modes of transportation. That's how people got around from island to island. That is to say, those who did go from island to island or from village to village. Colonists would use boats of other sorts, I suppose, some of them, but grassroots, kayak. Now we're going to move from the Aleutian Islands to the Kodiak Archipelago, our focus, main focus, if you would, here. We have a man from Kodiak Island, 1802, a woman from Kodiak Island, 1802, Toyen, chief from Nixuk Bay, Kodiak Island, woman from Kodiak Island named Tamima, a girl from Kodiak Island named Chen Vishuk, a woman from Ukamok Island, also known as Chirikov Island. This is a Toyon, a chief from Afognak Island. Afognak Island is in close proximity to Spruce Island, where St Hermann lived. He's a contemporary of these people, living with them, closely with them, intimately with them in a spiritual sense. Toyon, chief of Alaska Island, named Ayachuk, baptized as Andre, the year 1818. By that time, St. Hermann was living on Spruce Island. Toyon, chief from Kodiak Island, named Nankuk, baptized as Nikita. Woman from Kodiak Island, baptized as Pelagia. Native inhabitant of Kodiak Island, baptized as Martin. A man and woman of the Alaska Peninsula, Alutiiq also. And a Kodiak man in festive attire demonstrating hunting methods from the same year, 1818. Or from that year. So here we are. From the Alutiiq area, we're moving to the Tlingit area just quickly for a glance. Tlingit area here where Sitka is. It was the capital of Russian America. Okay. Here we have a Sitka Island Toyon, a Sitka Island chief, Katlian with his wife. This is a sketch from 1827. A depiction of an Alutiiq man, from an Aleut man, an Alutiiq man, and a Tlingit man, all three together, these three men, Aleut, Alutiiq, and Tlingit, in ceremonial dress from the year 1827. And I put this in also, although it comes from a bit later, just because I think it's a lovely depiction of the Tlingit, published in 1862 in an atlas produced in Russia. Okay. So we've looked at demography somewhat from the past. What about today? Let's glance just very, very quickly. There are approximately 95 Orthodox churches and chapels in Alaska. Most are Native Alaskan parishes. Native Alaskans comprise 18 to 19.6% of the state's population. Okay. Here's some photos. I use these photos. I think they're lovely. That's why, just because I like them. And they're by the artist, the Alaskan artist, Ree Munoz. Some of these churches are American historic landmarks, US historic landmarks now. We've looked at geography, we've glanced at demography. Now let's go into the history. The missionaries arrived at Kodiak Island in the year 1794. Now let's ask ourselves, who were they? Why or how did they come, and what did St. Hermann do? The missionaries arrived at Kodiak in the year 1794. Who were they? 10 in total, probably, initially. 8 tonsured monastics and 2 church servitors. There's a question about the church servitors, therefore I say 10 total probable. 5 died by the turn of the century. 4 were mentioned in 1805 in a report from Kodiak. 3 only remained by 1819. 1 alone was still alive by the year 1825. That one was the monk Hermann, still alive by the year 1825. Not a priest monk, just a monk, the only survivor. 1794, he arrived at Kodiak. 1836, he reposed deep within the forest of Spruce Island in the Kodiak Archipelago after 42 years in the Kodiak area from his arrival to his repose. Another among those missionaries was the priest monk Makari, arrived 1794. 1795 summer, he was assigned to Unalaska Island on the Aleutian Islands. He was there with the Aleuts at Unalaska into the summer of 1796. That was 1 year. Then in the summer of 1796, he departed with as many as 6 Aleut leading men for St. Petersburg. He went to St. Petersburg with Aleut leading men to give a report in person to the throne about the gross abuses wrought by the Shelikoff Company's management in Alaska. Summer 1796, departure. Their route took normally 10 months to 1 year. That was the travel time, 10 months, 1 year. But they set out. Pause one moment, use your imagination to think about how they had to travel from the Aleutian Islands across the North Pacific by boat, then across the Okhotsk Sea by boat again, then overland by horse to Yakutsk, down the Lena River by barge to Irkutsk, then across the vast extent of Siberia in winter on sledge until they reached Moscow. And then from Moscow, these were men of rural areas in Moscow having to find their way to the imperial city, St. Petersburg. Congratulations to them. But while they were en route to St. Petersburg, in autumn 1796, there was a change of reign at St. Petersburg. The Empress Catherine the Great had a stroke. She'd reigned for 34 years. Her son acceded as the Emperor Paul I. He was of a different caliber. He reigned less than 5 years before he was assassinated. In St. Petersburg, the priest monk Makari was reprimanded for insubordination because he left his assignment. He was ordered to return to Alaska. From St. Petersburg, the priest monk Makari died on the return journey. So did his Aleut companions also. Now we should notice their alacrity, their motivation, and significantly, their alliance among themselves, the missionary priest monk with the Aleut leading men. Another example from the initial group of missionaries was or is the priest monk Juvenali. 1794, September, he arrived at Kodiak. 1794 through 95, winter, he visited villages in the Kodiak Archipelago and baptized many people. After winter 1795, he was assigned to the Alaska mainland, and he went. The next year, 1796, he disappeared. He disappeared. No historical sources exist about his disappearance, a forged diary only. In 1818, in a letter, St. Hermann, who was serving as the head of the surviving mission and who had been there throughout, said that he, that is the priest monk Juvenali, that the priest monk Juvenali had been killed. But the how and why of it is unknown. Rumors are contradictory. There is no accurate information available. The same can be said today, just as St. Hermann said, rumors are contradictory. There is no exact information available. But Juvenali was canonized by the OCA in the year 1980 as a martyr from one of those rumors. It has to be stated. Another example, Archimandrite Eosaph, 1794, head of the religious mission. 1798, summoned back to Irkutsk, eastern Siberia, to be elevated to the episcopacy. 1799, April, he was consecrated. He was consecrated as the Bishop of Kodiak. The Bishop of Kodiak, a newly established auxiliary see of the Irkutsk Eparchy. 1799, May, he drowned in a shipwreck in the North Pacific Ocean during his return voyage. So, with regard to the history now, we've seen that the missionaries arrived at Kodiak Island. We looked at some examples to see something about who they were. Now, let's ask ourselves, why? How did they come? How? Why did they come? They were chosen by Nazari, the igumen of Alaam Monastery, from a call by Metropolitan Gavril of St. Petersburg and Novgorod on behalf of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, in response to a request from Grigory Ivanovich Shelikov for clergy for Shelikov's company's colony at Kodiak. You may recall that this is the same company about which the Hieromonk Makari and the Aleut men were brave enough to voyage, to journey all the way to St. Petersburg to try to protest. So, yes, there we have it. In response to a request from Shelikov for clergy, for Shelikov's company's colony at Kodiak, but not in conformity with the request, but instead contrary to Shelikov's solicitation. A decade earlier, 1784, the fur company owned by Shelikov spearheaded a paramilitary invasion of Kodiak Island. Shelikov and his wife, Natalia Alexeyevna, were aboard one of the company's ships supervising the assault. In the aftermath, they established the company's colony at Kodiak. Reports that Shelikov sent to St. Petersburg were euphemistic about pacification, for the advance of civilization, and for the perpetuation of Christianity. Shelikov's request was a part of a larger solicitation for imperial favor. It was a specific request. He asked for priests. This indicates married priests. In a remote location at the extremity of the empire, their families would be totally dependent on the company for everything. Instead, the Holy Synod, through Metropolitan Gavril, forwarded the request to Nazari of Alaam, who chose not 2 married priests, but up to 10 monastics. What kind of monastics? Monks from the monastery of Alaam in Konovets in Karelia, the far north. Karelia is at the westernmost side of Russia, it still is. It's ethnographically Finnic, not Finnish, but Finnic. Karelia, it is far north. Those of you who are interested in Finnish history, let me interject quickly, if I may. Well, I probably shouldn't, but those of you who are interested may be pleased to know that Vala'am is at the center of the area where the ethnographer and linguist Longrot collected the oral histories for his transcription of the Finnic epic, the Kalevala. So all around Vala'am were these tradition bearers of that Finnic culture. Fantastic. Anyway, here we go. Yes, they were monks of the monasteries of Vala'am and Konevets in Karelia. The monastery of Vala'am on the rugged island, Vala'am on vast Lake Ladoga. The monastery of Konevets on the rugged island of Konevets on the vast Lake Ladoga. These were men of the far north themselves, accustomed to subarctic conditions on islands and in forests, monastics of the wilderness, accustomed to scarcity and ascesis, monastics of a certain caliber and ability, such as Archimandrite Iosaph, soon afterwards elevated to the episcopacy, and Hermann of Alaam, whose qualities the igumen of Alaam knew, a gift, we may say, from the igumen of Alaam to the Alaskans. At Vala'am Monastery, the monk Hermann sought the quiet of a skeet deeper in the forest than the monastery house itself. A skeet consists of a few monastic, as few as 2 or 3, under the guidance of the spiritual father. Eventually, with permission from the igumen Nazaria Vala'am, he embarked on the anchoritic or eremitic life of solitude in the forest. In 1793, the igumen who had observed his spiritual development attached him to the mission for Kodiak. A gift indeed, we may say, as Nazari was developing his own monastery. Yet he sent a man of such caliber to Alaska. Shelikoff had not requested that they come. Nevertheless, he received them with alacrity when they reached the city Irkutsk, the hub of eastern Siberia. His company was registered there. He ran his company's commerce from there. He lived with his wife and daughter in the city. He dispatched the monastics at his company's expense the vast distance from Irkutsk onwards to Kodiak. The following year, July 1795, Shelikoff died suddenly, unexpectedly, at home. The widow Shelikova inherited the lion's share of the business. Around this time, their daughter, with a dowry of company shares, married Nikolai Petrovich Razonov, a nobleman of some rank. The widow and son-in-law used his contacts in the imperial city, St. Petersburg, to gain, eventually, in 1799, the monopoly rights in Alaska for their company granted by the Emperor Paul I. So the missionaries arrived at Kodiak September 1794. No preparations had been made for them. They were reduced to foraging on the beach for food. While they found themselves at odds with the company management, they were welcomed by the native people on the Aleutian Islands as well as the Kodiak Archipelago, as ample historical sources attest. The on-site manager was Alexander Andreevich Voronov. He had total authority when the missionaries arrived. In 1794, his autocracy was consolidated when the company was granted monopoly rights in 1799. He was the chief manager on site for nearly 28 years in total, until he was replaced unceremoniously in January 1818, when the company administration was given by imperial charter to naval officers and a comparatively benign period of management began instead. As an aside, let's note for those with an interest in Saint Innocenty Veniaminov, who arrived a generation later. In January 1818, the change to naval officers as chief managers of the Russian-American company was a watershed. Why note this? So that the highly affirmative exemplary work by St. Innocenty with Alaska natives can be seen in this context. He arrived in the year 1824 on the other side of the watershed. Conditions were comparatively more humane. He cooperated with the company management on that side of the watershed. St. Hermann and his fellow missionaries came on the earlier side of the watershed when Baranov's management of Shelikov's company was brutal, and they aligned with the Alaska natives against the barbarism. Now, we've seen something about who the missionaries were and why or how they came. Now, let's ask ourselves, what did St. Hermann do? What did he do? 42 years he remained in the Kodiak area. As we know, 1794 he arrived. 1798 he was assigned to oversee the remaining few missionaries' domestic concerns. From 1807 he served as the head of the surviving mission, and in this capacity he cared particularly for the poor and the infirm. He protested on behalf of the native people against Baranov's administration of the Russian-American company, especially in the years 1802, 1805, and 1818. By 1819, coincidental with the watershed change in company administration, he resumed his anchoritic, eremitic life in the deep northern forest. He resumed this life of prayerful solitude on an islet known as Spruce Island, a distance of a few versts over the sea from Kodiak's main harbor. He called the site of his hermitage New Valaam. His move to the wilderness had its precedent among the Desert Fathers. Like theirs, his was above all not a move away from the people. He still continued to see and counsel visitors who came to him. These words written about St. John Climacus in the desert of Sinai during the 7th century apply equally to St. Hermann in the northern forest during the 19th century. People came to see him from the Kodiak area, the Alaska Peninsula, the Chugach Bay area, the Eastern Aleutian Islands. A few people lived on the small island itself. Some had settled there to be near him. Principal among them was Sophia Vlasova, the first among 12 women students or disciples who came to live closely alongside him by the year 1820, according to a credible contemporary source. She organized them and she supervised orphans who took refuge there also. He lived somewhat apart from them. He himself would visit frequently at times, paddling the distance to Kodiak Island. How would he paddle? We may ask ourselves, what sort of sea craft was paddled and frequently in the Kodiak Archipelago, as along the Aleutian Islands at that time? A kayak. In his earlier years, he remained at his hermitage, conducting the holy services according to monastic laws, living a strictly aesthetic life as a hermit. In his profound humility, he worked great miracles, speaking to angels who ministered to him, a simple monk in the forest, healing the infirm, foreseeing the future to console the bereft or to warn the haughty, pacifying the forces of nature. Miracles are recounted about him generation after generation from his own time. From his own time, we have the accounts, and then generation from generation until now. There's ample information about him. For example, Igumen Nazari, who observed the monastic hermit's spiritual development and who had attached him to the mission, remained in contact with him. They wrote letters to each other. Nazari's successor, the Igumen Ioafan, also corresponded by letter with the monastic hermit at New Valaam. Ioafan's successor, Igumen Damasin, collected information about him from various credible sources in the 1860s. Those are just some examples. The Kodiak Mission's Centennial in 1894, Vala'am Monastery published the primary source material that the igumens had collected. This reflects Vala'am's ongoing concern that he should be known with accuracy. The Venerable Monastery's commentary in the 1894 Centennial publication already referred to him as a holy elder. Now we can enter into the pilgrimage, having looked at the geography, the demography, the history. Pilgrimage, what, when, where, how? What is it? Some personal reflections have been asked of me. I'll do this just very, very quickly. Let me say this, that because it is the North Pacific and the climate is so unpredictable, getting to this little islet of Spruce Island is, for the pilgrims, itself a miracle. Okay, the fog has to clear. The North Pacific has to calm down. And there are plenty of stories of people who were unable to make the crossing from Kodiak Harbor to the islet, Spruce Island, because of the turbulence of the water or because of the thick fog. There are stories also about people who did arrive, but then became disoriented and couldn't find the path through the forest to the chapel. This stands where St Herman's hermitage once was. Yes, you go through the fog of the northern Pacific Ocean. It's all gray, gray water, gray sky, just a bubble of gray and turbulent. Oh my gosh, people are over the sides because of seasickness. Until finally, in the gray, a sliver of green opens, and then emerald green begins to appear, the lush foliage of the rainforest. We make landfall on the black sand. When I first did, coincidentally, that is to say by God's grace, at the very moment, a villager arrived from Uzinki, the village, the only village on the island. Well, it was at the time the only village on the island. There's another now. He brought his skiff up onto the beach, very animated, jumped out of the skiff, grabbed us, or me, kissing us 3 times each, and saying, Appa Hermann, Father Hermann, Appa Hermann, Appa Hermann, I've come to collect holy water. As we did as well. One is immersed in the sounds of myriad birds that nest on the island, but there is absolutely no worldly noise, only rugged cliffs, dense spruce forest, bright green moss covering everything, salmon jumping in the lagoon's waters, and the occasional fox and deer roaming from the black sand beach. That comes from the Atlas of American Orthodox Christian Monasteries. Spruce Island is covered with Sitka spruce trees, sometimes reaching 200 feet in height, with their moss-covered branches. The spruce trees present a majestic picture. Pilgrims were treated, this is a quotation from a group of Serbian pilgrims. The pilgrims were treated to a cruise around the area where they were greeted by local humpback whales who appeared to be performing for them, spouting water near their boat, and then diving down and resurfacing in sync. Now, the following set of quotations come from an article about a pilgrimage published in The Guardian. I've chosen it because it's remarkable that this was published about the pilgrimage in The Guardian, or more specifically, The Guardian's US edition. Guardian newspaper, yes. Here we go. On a foggy morning, pilgrims gather at Kodiak's harbor to board a mismatched collection of boats to make the journey to where Father Hermann lived. Local fishermen volunteer their vessels and time for transport. Towering over the cold gray water past patches of dark green kelp and the occasional orange jellyfish. Eventually, towering spruce trees and rocky cliffs begin to emerge out of the fog. A small golden dome is visible through the trees. Walking along a moss-paved pathway in a line, the pilgrims make their way past towering trees, several laden with worn Orthodox icons. When you enter the forest and go to the church, it's like a whole other world, said Ted Panamoryov, who is an Alutiiq from the nearby village of Usinki, as quoted in the Guardian article. Yes, Alutiiq. Being alone in the middle of it with your thoughts and your experience, you become one with it. Panamoryov said also, one with it. Sometimes you can't describe things, another pilgrim said, as quoted in the same article. As another pilgrim said, choking back tears because you feel it in your heart, in your soul, and there's a peace. There's a peace beyond understanding. Indigenous Alutiiq people have been making the journey across this short stretch of the Gulf of Alaska to Spruce Island for centuries. We've been coming to him here long before he was canonized as a saint, Ted Panamoryov explained. People from Usinki came here, took care of the priests that lived down here in the summers, Panamoryov explained furthermore. Note, Ted Panamoryov is Russian Orthodox, of course. We read some quotations from him a moment ago. So is Alexei Gonopolsky, whom we will hear in a video clip next. So are the majority of the Alutiiq nation to this day. And we could listen to a clip here that comes from a video series produced by the Elastic Public Media. I hope you can hear this. If not, you can just watch.
We're in Kodiak, Alaska. We're heading to Spruce Island. This is a pilgrimage to St. Herman. St. Herman is a first saint in North America. There's a small story of Saint Innocent, who is another saint he's been a bishop here. One time he came over, he was trying to land right here in Kodiak. The weather was so bad they couldn't land for I don't know, something along the lines of 3 days. And he said, Father Herman, if you found favor in God's eyes, please let the weather stop. And the weather stopped and they landed right there. And so every year, people from all over the world come to venerate St. Herman. We'll make a trip out to Spruce Island, and hopefully we can get through this fog bank. So, so maybe we'll have to pray.
Oh, yes. People come to St. Herman from all over the world today. They come today as people have come to him through generations. They come as people did when he was living here in the flesh. And pilgrims say that he blesses them now too. Looked at what the pilgrimage is, or something about it. Let's look at let's see when it occurs. Summer months, June to September, because the weather is too difficult and the crossing is usually impossible outside of these months. Yes, June to September. Where? You fly to Anchorage. And then from Anchorage, one can fly 1 hour to Kodiak Island. Alternatively, someone can drive. It would take about 16 hours to Homer, via Homer. One drives to Homer, then takes the ferry boat to Kodiak. It's a very long, 16 hours, but very beautiful. Flying, of course, is easier. Okay. What, when, where, now, how? Okay. During the summer months, and how? Either through the Serbian Orthodox skeets at Spruce Island anytime during the summer, or through the OCA Cathedral Seminary at Kodiak on August 7th through 9th annually, or perhaps on your own for those who are even more adventurous. Okay, here's the contact data. I'm going to copy it and paste it into chat for you. Okay, there you should have it in your chat window if you'd like to have it. Okay, or you can go to Valaam Monastery. St. Herman is venerated as one of their own great saints, Valaam. From London to St. Petersburg, that's a 3-hour flight, quite near. And then from St. Petersburg up to this village and then across by boat to Valaam Monastery. That takes a number of hours. Yes. But one should contact the monastery or make provisions before. They have a matochion in St. Petersburg that can be helpful. So we've looked at the pilgrimage, what, when, where, how. Our meeting agenda today took us into the geography, the demography, the history, and the pilgrimage itself. And I hope, yes, I think we do have time for some questions. I don't think I took all the time. So Margaret, it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mousalimas. That was so detailed and wonderful to get a real feel for the geography in particular. I found that really helpful to understand how the missionaries were operating, and indeed the history of St Herman, and just wonderful pictures of the scenery as well. I feel like I've experienced a walk in nature through those beautiful forests. So thank you for that. I'm going to, we have a couple of questions which have already been posted in the chat, so we can go to those. I also encourage people, if they haven't posted their questions already, please do that, and I will just scroll up slightly. So John had a question, which I think you covered in part, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts a bit. He spoke about when many Catholic and Protestant groups are remembered for inflicting cultural and literal violence on Indigenous Americans, so across the whole of North America, to an extent, I would say. Why was the mission led by St Herman, or with St Herman, so different and so successful when you said that so many of the Alutiiq, or all of them, had been baptized and converted by the time that St Innocent arrived? Why do you think that was?
It's a wonderful question, and I think you're going to have to press a button to stop me.
Okay.
No, really, it's absolutely fantastic. It's an absolutely key question. First of all, we have to be humble about it, and look at these missionaries and other clergy who are reflecting the best. No, who's to say the best? Who are reflecting? Let me say, the essence of our Orthodox faith, because we have numbers of others who do not and did not. So I think some humility is necessary. But within that, there's certain things that we may be able to see. I mean, these people were more closely related than we find in other histories. I mean, earlier I said that these monastics came from Karelia, their monastery was in Karelia. And I tried to indicate what was occurring there among the Orthodox Finnic people, the Karelians. I mean, that's where the Protestant Finn Lonrot went to collect the oral histories for what became the Finnish epic Kalevala, and his main source, living source of this oral tradition was a starets, a leader of the Orthodox Church in one of the villages. For example, when in the same year when St. Herman arrived at Kodiak Island, Vancouver was exploring in the Aleutian Islands, and he could not distinguish the Russians from the natives. They lived together, they ate the same sort of foods, they wore the same sort of clothes, and he went on to say, they worshiped in the same way according to the Greek church. And that's the term that was used at the time, not to be dovetailed into what some things that are happening now. Yes. Yes. There we have it. Yes. So the relationships were very close. So you have these, yes. Also, we must understand the culture that Russia itself had been colonized internally through Peter I. So there were natural alliances, for example, between Makari, the priest monk, and the Aleut leading men. So all of these cultural factors and sociological factors mesh, I should say, or merge with this essence of the Orthodox faith, which tells us that the Holy Spirit is everywhere present and filleth all things, so that these men can see the spark of divinity in people. There's much to explore, and much has to be done to look at this interface between between culture and theology. Thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you. And I think it sort of brings to mind also comparisons with people like St. Nicholas of Japan, who also, was very much about living with the Japanese and understanding the culture and so on. We've had a question, which is a great question, and I would love to know this as well. So from Anya, who says, why were you so interested in St. Herman of Alaska and dedicating chapters to him in your dissertation and so on?
Well, the second part, the second part of the question is easier. A chapter ought to be devoted to him, a full chapter in any study that examines the transition of the Alutiiq and Aleut people and other Native Alaskan people to Orthodoxy. He is so important that he should comprise a chapter. He was served as a missionary for 42 years, and a profound one. And I should mention as well that not only are his miracles recounted generation after generation, as they recur or occur generation after generation, people in our generations refer to him, Alaskan people refer to him as if he were their own grandfather, just living over there on the island. So really, this is not fanciful. We had a colloquium at Oxford a couple of years ago, and Sven Håkansson, the name is Norwegian from an ancestor of his, but they are Alutiiq, and his father was an Alutiiq Toyon chief of tremendous stature and staunch Russian Orthodox, as is the son. He's on the faculty at the University of Washington in Seattle, doing really good work. Yes, he himself said this at Oxford, coming from the University of Washington in Seattle, holding his own doctoral degree from Harvard University. He just said, yes, people and referred to him as if he were their own grandfather, no, just as their own grandfather living on the island. So a chapter ought to be devoted to him. Am I so keen on him? Well, I don't think I should talk about myself. I just should say, who would not be? How could one not be absolutely fascinated? Absolutely fascinated. And then I did go on pilgrimage by God's grace. But, yes, so I hope that's okay.
Yes, thank you. So the monastery on Spruce Island, it is an active monastery. Do you know how many monks are there? Presumably they live there all year round, and so they're quite cut off for much of the year, as you were saying. How is that happening? And you mentioned the Serbian skeets.
Yes, thank you for asking that question, Margaret. It's an important question, and
Yeah,
you're correct to say that they are.
It's from Sister Nina. Sorry, I should have mentioned.
Oh, I see. Fine. Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed. Well, it's a good question. And thank you for asking the question. You are correct, Margaret, that you are correct that it is cut off, that they are cut off for much of the year. There are actually two monasteries. There's a male monastery, a monastery for men on Spruce Island itself, and there's a monastery for women on an even smaller and even more remote islet nearby. Both of them are under the jurisdiction of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Yes, there are, I'm not sure how many monks. I know that there are a few more monks, men, monastic, than women monastics. The last I heard, there were 4 women monastics. But, you know, when we think about the history of it, which isn't brought out clearly enough, but really I think ought to be, the women monastics there are in the ongoing tradition, because if we look back, it was Sofia Vlasova and other women who coalesced around St Herman as their spiritual father, as for example occurred on Kefalonia around St Gerasimos. The island of Kefalonia increased around St. Gerasimos centuries ago. Yes, same sort of pattern. So yes, there are the 2 monasteries here. They're both small monasteries. They are both active all year long, and they are both hospitable. Even the women's monastery receives pilgrims, women only, and they will help you to go if anyone wants to go. I put the contact information in the chat. You can contact them. They will help you to go. You can go and stay with them if anybody wants to, or they can give advice. Staying with them is very, very rigorous. I mean, if you can imagine. So it's not for everyone. It really is an experience of living in a cabin in the north. But they can help you, even if you wish to stay in Kodiak or in people's houses in the village nearby.
And a connected question from Victor, which is, what's the connection with the Serbian Orthodox Church there in Alaska, given that most of the rest of the churches in Alaska are under OCA?
Yes, well, they're under OCA by default. God bless, but it needs to be said. Okay, not yes. The 2 monasteries are, I think we could call them metochia. I'm not sure if they are officially called metochia, of a monastery in Northern California. The monastery is named after St. Herman of Alaska. That monastery, and it went through a bit of let's say an extreme phase. It became extreme for a while, and then, which they themselves admit, and they're very open about this. Yes, and then retracted, and brought themselves deliberately under the jurisdiction of one of the fully canonical patriarchates, and put themselves within that context. So yes, they chose to put themselves under the Serbian patriarchate and to take spiritual advice accordingly, which I think makes sense. But
Yes.
I shouldn't be talking too much about that. Excuse me if I went too far.
No, that's okay. Thank you. I'm sure we'll take it with discernment on that. Thank
Good.
you. I think I'd like to cover just two more questions, which we have. And Ted has asked, what effect did the change from Russian to US control have in the religious life of the area?
Phenomenal. It's a great question, and the perspective is amazing. First of all, one has to understand that the selling away was absolutely bizarre. I mean, it wasn't just land that was sold away; it was people. I mean, it was just away like that. Yeah, absolutely amazing thing. But anyway, yes. So the Russian Orthodox Church never abandoned the people there. So they continued to Saint Innocent, who was active in Alaska, then became the Archbishop of in Yakutsk, etc. In the same year, was summoned to Moscow to be elevated to the Metropolitan of Moscow, which was the highest position of the Russian Orthodox Church at the time. He himself, as we saw earlier, was a man of the far north of the East. Anyway, but yeah, so he was elevated. He was summoned from these regions to become the Metropolitan of Moscow at the very same time. And from that position, he was able to help as much as he could the Alaskan people. And I believe, although I don't have any evidence for it, I believe that he was, most probably, he was elevated for this reason at that time. Well, how else? Such a coincidence. Okay. Nevertheless, these people who had become Orthodox were sold away along with Alaska into American possession. And the Americans then set missionaries onto them, Protestant missionaries mainly. The relationships now are pretty cordial, but at the time they were not. These were aggressive missionaries. And the Alaskan people had to maintain this faith not only against that pressure to convert, but also to maintain the whole Orthodox life in their villages on their own with their own clergy, which they did.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
Astonishing. Not only that, they became missionaries. The Aleut and Aleutic people became missionaries to the Yupik Eskimos and Athabascans. Furthermore, Tlingit people who resisted Russian imperialism, except around Sitka, resisted and therefore refused to become Russian Orthodox during the Russian period, converted in quite large numbers right after the sale of Alaska. People say it's because the pressures were put on them by the Presbyterians whom the Americans assigned there. The Presbyterians were most active in the Tlingit area, so the pressures were intense. And the Toyons, the chiefs, decided that if they were going to be Christian, they would be Orthodox because it was closer to them, or whatever the motivation. It occurred after the sale of Alaska. So rather than diminishing, Orthodoxy increases quite extraordinarily, very much at the grassroots. This also indicates the extent to which these people are Orthodox, and to the extent to which Orthodoxy was engrafted into the native cultures of Alaska. It is a testimony to this fact, and not copious, I should say, substantial sources exist to prove the fact. My own research begins with the premise that this religion became the Alaskan zone, and it quotes sources every decade from 1867 onwards to our own times, decade after decade after decade, objective sources, American census workers, ethnographers, no one who's Orthodox, none of them Orthodox, who say over and over again, Russian Orthodoxy or Greek Orthodoxy, as that word was used, from the Greek Church, is this people's own religion, decade after decade. So it doesn't diminish, it increases, and it's testimony to the extent to which Orthodoxy was engrafted.
Thank you. I would like just to ask one final question on behalf of Joanna, which I think will serve to bring us to a bit of a conclusion as well, which is, you mentioned some of the miracles of St Herman. I wonder whether there's one that you would like to expand on, just to tell us a little more perhaps about one of them, one that you find particularly moving or interesting that you could share with us.
I think they're astounding. But the ones that I would talk about are the ones that come to us like soft breeze in a tumultuous north. He fed bears with his hand. They too would come to visit him.
That's wonderful.
That's a miracle.
Yes, and just those pictures that we saw at the very beginning of the presentation of those bears, it's so dramatic, isn't it? That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Mousalimas. I really am so grateful that you were able to take the time and join us, as most people know, but just for others who joined us later, that you've joined us from California and in the morning there. Thank you so much for taking the time and giving us such a detailed and wonderful presentation about St Herman of Alaska. I encourage everyone, if you are able, just to go back onto gallery view so that we can wave at each other again and have some human contact as part of our Zoom call. It's wonderful to have so many of you with us. Thank you. Just one final thing before we go. We do have our charity collection as part of this series. If you are able to give something, I encourage you to do so. It can be as small amount as you like. I've put the link again into the chat, and please do contribute something if you can. It's for 2 educational charities in the Holy Land. And once again, I thank you all for your time this evening. I hope you may be able to join us next Monday for our next session, which is on the Nativity of Christ and the House of Bread, the town of Bethlehem in the Holy Land. I hope you can join us then. In the meantime, thank you. Thank you for showing the icon again, the bowers in the picture there. Thank you. I ask the prayers of St Herman of Alaska and all the saints of Alaska and North America. It was his feast yesterday on the new calendar, St Herman. So it's very apposite that we've been talking about him tonight. Thank you, Dr. Mousalimas.
Thank you, Margaret. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.